Back in early December, a friend of mine sent me a meme she'd read online. It went, "Is it time for the 'let's pick this up in the new year' emails yet? Because I have a lot of work I don't fancy doing until 2024. And sure enough, about a week or so later, that time did indeed roll round, and my colleagues and I started deferring meetings and tasks and all manner of ideas into the new year, which always feels like a really long way away, but would in fact be about now. And despite me doing this pretty much every year, I never seem to learn. December me has January me on this productivity pedestal based on the volume of tasks that December me thinks January me can handle. January me thinks December me is an idiot. January me is right. And so it was with a huge sense of relief that I read this advice from a friend sent on Friday. Be nice to yourself today. I know it's only the first Friday of the first week of the year, and it's going to sound completely terrible to say, but I already feel behind while rationally knowing that's not possible. Behind what? Behind who? It's only January the 5th. Relax. You've done good work this week. And if not work, then life. You did a little bit of life. And isn't that great? That's more than enough for any week. Be nice to yourself. And it's such vital advice, deceptive in its simplicity and maybe revolutionary in its philosophy. Because our world does not want us to be so accepting of ourselves. Our society, in fact, thrives on the very opposite of this peaceful and tolerant state. There's not enough hustle, not enough urgency, not enough lack. As one sleep specialist warns us, we live in a world that glamorizes the grind, which means that millions of people are living in a chronic state of stress, which leads to numbing behaviors such as watching Netflix for hours or mindlessly scrolling social media to avoid daily stressors. And this tension is something that these companies thrive on. The Netflix CEO, Reed Hastings, is very clear on the physiological challenge they create. You get a show or a movie that you're really dying to watch, he said, and you end up staying up late at night. So we actually compete with sleep. And then he added, and we're winning. It's not a competition. Any of us should want Netflix or indeed any entertainment platform to win. Lack of sleep is linked to an increased rate of heart disease, type 2 diabetes, and obesity. It makes us angrier, more unhappy, less capable of creative, compassionate, and intelligent thought. So that's one more thing to worry about as you lie awake at 3 a.m., unable to sleep. And for many of us, the Christmas period does not provide respite from our busyness. And maybe we take some sense of comfort from the recurring sense of travel and movement that we find in the nativity accounts. First Joseph and Mary, then the shepherds, and finally the wise men, all have journeys to make, frequently uncomfortable and even perilous. But there's another way to look at these journeys that is just as important, and that is to notice the vital role of the moments of rest. In our reading today, we see the wise men reaching the object of their journey, overwhelmed with the magnitude of fulfilling their purpose, and then finding rest. And in that rest, finding God, receiving a warning in a dream, not to return to Herod, but to travel to their own country by another road. Shortly after this, the Holy Family also receive God's protection through sleep, as Joseph is warned in a dream to flee to Egypt in order to save Jesus from Herod. In Matthew's nativity, then, rest is linked with guidance and sanctuary. It is an act of revelation, restoration, and love. And there are notable similarities between the experience of the wise men and the Holy Family and that of Elijah, whose story we heard in our Old Testament reading. For they are each on journeys to escape from peril. Their lives are in danger. They are each in need of God's care and deliverance, and each find God's guidance in their rest. Elijah's journey is the most detailed of the three accounts. He is escaping the irate death threats issued by Queen Jezebel, who is demanding revenge for the killing of her Baal priests. He feels he has failed God, and he can't put enough distance between him and the dangers facing him or the inadequacies tormenting him. Even when he has fled Israel, Elijah continues running for another day until he is deep in the wilderness and utterly helpless. Only then does Elijah stop and sleep. And in this rest, he receives God's care. An angel provides food and drink, and then Elijah rests again. And it is through these acts of resting that God reaches out to Elijah and restores him. For as the angel tells Elijah, without the sustenance and rest provided, the journey will be too much for you. And so we have three prominent accounts of God using sleep to guide and to save, which underlines the way in which sleep is an act of grace. It can only be received. I read a conversation between the theologian James Bryan Smith and Tish Harrison Warren about the theological significance of sleep. You cannot force your body to sleep, Smith said. Sleep is an act of surrender. To sleep, we must yield to our limitations. We are needy and fragile. Yet we can rest because it is not by our own efforts, abilities, or successes that we keep ourselves, our lives, or the world intact. It is a perspective beautifully expressed in Psalm 127. Unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. It is in vain that you rise up early and go late to rest, eating the bread of anxious toil, for the Lord gives sleep to his beloved. Sleep is an act of grace, and it underlines the importance and maybe the difficulty of letting go and simply receiving God. It's a countercultural thing to do, ingrained in us from our earliest years. The author Nathan Stuckey remembers a youth group volunteer trip to Kentucky when he was a teenager. He describes his group as a bunch of farm kids who knew their way around a hammer and a circular saw. And when they got to the volunteer site, they did what they knew how to do best. They worked. They also knew how to eat. At one point during the week, the people that ran the ministry had to make a choice. The teenagers' appetites were throwing off the budget. Nathan and his friends were eating more than any other youth group had before. Should they try to make them eat less? Ultimately, the leadership decided not to attempt to curb these appetites. Why? As the story was later told, the director of the project pronounced, "I don't care how much they eat. They're getting more work done than any other group I've seen." But as he reflected on this experience as an adult, Stuckey has come to see the problem with the story. He writes, "It begins with us. It depends on our effort, and it leaves virtually no room for failure. In other words, it is a story devoid of grace. It is also a story devoid of rest." Stuckey continues, "I want my children to know that who they are cannot be reduced to any work they can or cannot do. I want them to know they were loved before they existed. I want them to know they will always be loved. And I want them to know that love and grace are just part of who they are. I want them to know that love and grace are just part of who God is. Love and grace are just part of who God is. And so God calls us to rest, to open ourselves to God's love and to be restored. And we see this emphatically reinforced at the end of Elijah's time in the wilderness, when Elijah directly encounters God. It is an almost cinematic passage as the frenzy of the world explodes across the landscape. Rocks shatter, the wind whips at trees, and the earth shakes. But that is not where God is. God is unexpectedly and majestically in the silence, a sound of sheer silence, a stillness so complete you can feel it. As we see throughout the Bible, throughout history, and even throughout our lives, our God is a counterintuitive God, appearing in ways and places that we would least expect, not found in the palace, but in a stable, not come as a warrior, but as a baby, not in the storm, but in the silence. Brother Jeffrey Tristram writes, If we desire to come to know God, we need to find our resting place, to identify that profound stillness at the heart of our being. One way to do this is through breath prayers, which are a wonderfully restful way to pray that transforms prayer from a task, maybe even a chore, into a gift. We don't have lists of people and places to remember. We don't need requests or answers. We just need to be still and be open to God. Breath prayers are an ancient Christian form of prayer, dating back to somewhere between the 3rd and 6th centuries, and possibly even earlier, as some historians see the Psalms as a form of breath prayer. And breath prayers are simple and adaptable. You choose 1 or 2 phrases or lines of scripture and breathe through them. Inhale on the first phrase, exhale on the second. Pause and repeat. Inhale, may my rest be an altar. Exhale, to encounter the healing of God. Inhale, God with us. Exhale, still always. Inhale, friend of my soul. Exhale, come rest with me. Stillness, rest, grace. As Anne Lamott famously wrote, almost everything will work again if you unplug it for a few minutes, including you. I find this message, this promise, more important now, at the start of the year, liturgically in ordinary time, than in a season of celebration such as Christmas. Because as a gift from God, rest must not just be for special occasions, but for every day. As an act of grace, rest is not something we need to strive for and earn our way towards. It is something we need only accept, as simply and effortlessly as breathing. A gift from God to receive and enjoy and treasure and honor. God with us, still, always. Praise be to God.